panels here. So we are joined by Grace Boone from CDA. First, Ahmed from Peace Direct, and from Search for Common Ground. And I'm especially delighted to welcome Tala here from Mindanao. She's going to speak to us about her experience with the transition project in the Philippines. So very excited to have her here. She ultimately can speak to this much better than anybody else can. Without any further ado, get started.
Great. Yeah, thank you all for being here. It's nice to have a full room. So we are the Stopping at Success Consortium and Partners and Friends. And we'll have a slideshow that kind of gives you a little bit of, if you're a reader, it'll be up on the screen. But so what are we? We are a 3-year collaborative learning project that's funded by USAID. And we look at, you can go to the next slide. And we look at transitions, INGO transitions to local entities. And we've done that the past 2 years. We've done over 20 case studies in 13 countries, really looking at outliers, really, of where have INGO exits been successful and transitioned to a local entity, and what has that looked like? Why is that? Who's a part of that process, and things like that. Our goal ultimately is to promote locally led development, and that is at the center of what we do and who we are. And we're also currently in the last year of our project, where we are doing the analysis and meeting making stage of our project. So taking these 20 case studies and trying to create practical guidance, trying to consolidate our lessons, trying to find things across cases that are themes, that are things that are coming up, in a hope that we can use these practical resources to then influence the INGO and the aid sector at large. So that is us. And today we are going to share, we thought it'd be helpful before Tala starts sharing her experience, just to give you an overview of some of the broad themes that we have found. Again, I think we did a session here in January and trying to kind of see how we've evolved and kind of where our analysis sits now before we dive into a real life example. So our first theme is capacity development. And we use the term development rather than capacity building, because we acknowledge that there are existing strengths and resources in the places that we go. Nothing's being built. And the first part of this, so we're seeing across all 20 case studies, we're seeing that there have been elements of capacity development that have really allowed for a successful transition. And we've looked across cases, in the sense there have been devolution cases, there have been handover cases, there have been instances where the INGO has broken up into many different organizations. So we're seeing a variety of examples, and we're seeing that across all of those, that capacity development is a core theme to why the transition's been successful. It's also intimately linked with our leadership theme and how leaders and people that are taking on ownership of the organization need and sometimes have the capacity development aspect to the transition. So I thought, to kind of ground this in reality, one aspect of capacity development that we focus on is the idea of two-way capacity development. So often the traditional form of capacity development is, INGOs give capacity development activities to local entities. And we acknowledge in our project that local entities and local actors also influence and affect and improve the capacities of INGOs at large. So this idea that it's not a one-way street, right? It goes both ways. I thought an example that I could give you is from our Mercy Corps case in Bosnia. And in this particular case, it was so successful. So the local entities dissolved into a microfinance organization, the first in their country. And it went so well that Mercy Corps kept a staff member on the local entity's board just as a learning partner, just wanting to absorb, why is this happening? Why was this so successful? Like, what are the things at play here? And that was then used to then try to replicate it in other instances. So, it's an example of an INGO actively trying to learn from local partners on the ground. And we see that in a lot of different instances, and we think that's important to note here. Another one is Care Maroc in Morocco. In Care Maroc, the organization, the local entity, became the first CARE member affiliate and worked to get their agenda into the global network. And so we see like the local influencing the global in a really interesting way. And we see this in a lot of instances. The second point I wanted to make is going beyond training. So we're seeing that we need more creative examples of capacity development that are used as opposed to training. And there's a variety of reasons that training is often a go-to, but just a quick point here, in one of our meetings, we're seeing that there's always room for accompaniment, and we're hearing that on the ground too, right? So there's creative things that we can do beyond training, and making sure that all of our activities are targeted and tailored by like what people need, and not necessarily set by the agenda that we have originally. In one of our Burundi cases, we see that local NGOs talk about how there are INGOs want to give certain type of capacity development activities to local organizations and not others, in order to keep them from being competitors. And that's an interesting thing, where kind of assessing what are the power structures that are staying because of these capacity development activities. And lastly, to wrap up, we wanted to talk about adaptive feedback mechanisms. So the idea, we see this in one of our cases where as we're going along our capacity development activities, are we asking, like, is this working? Is this meeting your needs? Like, is this being effective? Trying to think through just that it's relevant and that it makes sense. And then if it's not, how do we adapt what we're doing to fit what people need, and how do we really meet the needs of people? And we see this in one case really well in our Kenyan case study. We see that the INGO at every stage of their capacity development plan set in feedback mechanisms to make sure they're collecting feedback and then changing programming, which is amazing. So there's so much, about this particular theme that we could go into, but I'll leave it there for now and hand it over to David.
Sure. Thanks, Grace.
Yeah.
I'm David Yamron from Search for Common Ground, and I'll be talking briefly about the second key theme that we wanted to go over today, which is financial sustainability. So this is unsurprising, I think, to most of us, that this is one of the most critical themes that we've encountered across our 20 case studies, and in different ways with different types of transitions. So from INGOs at program ends, handing off new activities to a local entity, to CSOs or municipal governments, or INGO country blends. And I think first we want to talk about the steps that we found that have been successful, where an INGO can take before, during, and after a transition to ensure financial sustainability, to ensure that the new local entity can be financially sustainable. Excuse me. So we broke this into two key questions that we've presented at forums like this and in regional workshops with our case study participants. The first is, how can INGOs and donors support the new organization to ensure financial sustainability? And I think our clear conclusion is that there's many forms of support beyond what we can call a standard model of financial support, like a direct cash infusion or something like that. While cash is always appreciated, it's always useful. There's many other avenues, many options that an INGO can take to support their new entity. In addition to that, I'd like to mention that there's a downside to these sort of direct cash infusions. We've seen that sort of nurture dependence on an INGO and perpetuate the sorts of power dynamics that I think that are interested in locally led development are interested in combating a little bit. We've seen a case in Burundi where a spin-off organization is still 9 years later receiving 95% of their funding from the original INGO, which is it's difficult to call that locally led development or truly independent local organization. So what are these other forms of financial support that we've seen? We've seen INGOs provide investments in hard assets. So this can be really useful, especially in countries with expensive real estate, for example. So in Georgia, we saw Oxfam buy office space for the new local entity bridge that they spun off, giving them a huge head start. They would have had no way to make rent otherwise. Overhead, I think, in particular, and operating costs are a clear issue here. Other than funding program activities, it's often difficult for local organizations to fund their administrative costs, things like rent. In the Philippines, we saw a similar example where World Vision brokered a free rent and utilities deal for their spin-off organization, using their sort of influence and wealth as a large international NGO to work with the government to set that up. PADCO in Burundi transferred computers and furniture to their local entity after transition. These sort of really very simple actions that INGOs can take to set their local entities up for success. We've also seen some non-financial support, and this comes in a few different forms across our case studies. Grace mentioned capacity development, and one thing that we've heard loud and clear from local organizations is that capacity development around business development, grants management, financial administration, proposal development, and fundraising is absolutely critical. These are things that are often overlooked in traditional capacity development plans, often because funding is limited for them from donors. But taking the time to build a capacity development plan that develops specifically fundraising and financial sustainability capacities has been really important. Other things include like Plan India we saw, Oxfam in Georgia hired a consultant to create a business model, a business plan with their local entities. Care Burundi worked with GLEAD, their spinoff, to create a staff capacity development plan to address gaps like the ones I previously mentioned. Also in Burundi, PADCO continued to provide assistance after transition with the new local entity with things like preparing project proposals, providing technical advice, and conducting advocacy on the local entity's behalf with the government. These can also be things like providing references to donors. In Timor-Leste, one of the cases that I worked on, we saw Columbia University made a point of bringing Bellin, the local entity's staff, to donor meetings prior to the transition. A tiny step that made a huge difference in creating connections between a local partner that would ultimately help them sustain themselves after the international entity departed. These sorts of connections with donor and peer networks in particular, providing introductions to key aid stakeholders, helping build relationships, have been highlighted over and over again. I think the final point I want to make on this specific question is transferring knowledge management resources to the local entity. So this can be in the form of policies like HR and finance policies, things that might be difficult to create for a local organization composed only of program staff, and that really can give them a heads up in creating a successful administration internally. It can also be proposal databases. So again, in Georgia, Oxfam gave their entity Bridge access to their entire proposal database. Their argument was that this knowledge management was originally collected from the Global South and is merely them giving it back after this transition, saying it's only fair. So the second key question I think that we've been asking ourselves is, what operational models and financial innovations do we see national entities use after transitions? So this is the other side of the coin. Especially for local NGOs, transition can often mean a struggle for financial resources, winning grants, especially around unrestricted funds. So there's a variety of funding models we've seen be successful, ranging from in Bosnia, it was great, which Grace mentioned, running an extremely successful microcredit operation to fund operational costs. We've seen social enterprises like Coffee for Peace, which Tala will talk about in just a couple minutes. Another example is that consultant I mentioned that was hired by Oxfam to work with Bridge on a business model. They determined that to ensure sustainability, Bridge would need an advisory to raise revenue through trainings and consultancy projects. It's just another example of the sorts of innovative models beyond the traditional that we've seen be successful. I'm just going to give one more example and then hand it off to Farzana. Independence for local entities can often mean, and often must mean, diversifying funding streams. So in SOS Children's Village, Colombia, which spun off from the international SOS Children's Village, INGO, the new local entity existed in an environment with shrinking international funding to Colombia, a medium income country with less opportunity for winning grants. SOS started to look to domestic sources of funding. The transition triggered them to form a stronger relationship with local and regional governments, who now directly fund many of their projects. They've sought partnerships with Colombian corporations, getting CSR funds. And finally, they've embarked on a series of public campaigns which have fundraising and advocacy components. These campaigns aim to bring attention to children's issues, which is their focus. They collect donations from the public and things like in the supermarkets or public spaces like that. And those public campaigns at this point provide a majority of their unrestricted funding. Just another example of the sorts of things that we've seen through our case studies. I think I'll pause there and hand it off to Farzana to discuss our third theme.
Right, so I'm just going to talk a bit about partnerships, which is a really broad theme, and it's so cross-cutting with financial sustainability and capacity development. So I won't go into too much detail of all the points, but the one thing to say, of course, is a lot of the lessons that we learned around successful partnerships really plays out in the Coffee for Peace case study. So I'm sure you'll mention a lot of the things anyway. So some of the things that from our case studies that we found, which might seem quite obvious, but still not common. But some of the things that we have found is that actually transparent relationship building from the very beginning leads to successful transitions and exits. So when an effort is made to build trusting relationships at the beginning, so for example, with Coffee for Peace, at the beginning, a good 2 to 3 years was spent on just relationship building. So there was no money funneled into Mindanao, there were no projects. It was just relationship building. And in the end, when the journey towards sustainability, when that was happening, it was a far smoother process than in other cases where local organizations are just brought in after decisions are made externally, and they're just brought in to respond to predetermined decisions, really. So that leads to kind of the next point around collaborative decision making. So that really kind of links with various kind of power dynamics, because sometimes on the surface it may look like a project or activity is locally led, but when you actually look at the decision making processes that are behind these processes, it really that's a bit kind of a more interesting way of deciding whether something really is truly locally led. So to give an example of the SOS Children's Village, when SOS in Colombia, they had quite a long history in Colombia, and when they were still being funded and supported by the international body SOS Austria, they were actually, one of the projects that they had was the Children's Village model. So it's almost like an orphanage type model. And that wasn't very popular in Colombia at all. But that program continued for around over 20 years. And only when the decision was made by SOS Austria to stop funding did SOS Colombia have to make programmatic shifts, because the funding was coming from a domestic source. So then they focused on more long-term, providing like long-term educational services, social services, things like that. So that's kind of like an interesting case where when collaborative decision making takes place around program design, like what that means for locally relevant programs, compared to when these models are just taken from outside. So that was an interesting point. And then we have this thing that we found around like the silent partner. So just to kind of, that's sort of more around like, just partnerships don't have to be visible in order to be meaningful. So I know the Mennonite Central Committee is a lot of the time the silent partner to letting local organizations and local entities lead. But then another example is the example of Interpeace in Timor-Leste. So the partner that they had from the beginning, they allowed their partner to be on the driving seat of program design and program implementation, and also in identifying what the program and what the issues are in the communities. So they were unconcerned about their own branding, and they were happy to work behind the scenes. And right now, they still have a partnership with their previous local partner, but it's not structured around funding or finances, but more around solidarity, and they do things like provide mentorship and so on. So that's kind of the concept of the silent partner, I think, is quite interesting, which you'll touch on, I'm sure. And then lastly is the continued partnerships beyond exit has been a really important theme that's come up, I think, in all of our case studies. In all of our case studies, the partnerships between the international local entities, when funding has stopped, the partnerships continued in some form. And I think that's just a really important thing to emphasize, because no one that we spoke to have said, oh, there should be an end to foreign aid, or there should be an end to partnerships completely. But it's just about how do you how do you shift that partnership in a way that is more balanced and equal? So just to bring back the example of Care Maroc, I mean, that was a case where Care Maroc devolved from the Care in France, and then so what ended up happening was, one of the things that ended up happening was that they were influencing the Care International's agenda, and they were drawing on another international agenda around the Sustainable Development Goals on education. So this was an interesting kind of example of a local organization drawing on international agendas to influence another international entity. So just kind of, it's not always helpful to have those dichotomies, we understand, and that is especially when you look at partnerships after funding has stopped. Those lines are more blurred. It's not like just kind of the given recipient. It's far more complicated than that. Do you want to go on the Coffee for Peace? I think. Right. So I'm going to let Tala talk about Coffee for Peace, but just to give some quick kind of framing of the case study. So this case study was conducted by Peace Direct last year. And the case study is basically one of where the peace building organization in Mindanao was created, and in order to become self-sustainable, they developed a social enterprise. And it's a really interesting case study because I think it was almost unexpected. And the decision to the steps that were taken towards sustainability came from local actors, so people on the ground. And it wasn't so much at a time where there was funding pressures. I feel like it's a case study that really shows that decisions to exit can take place even when funding is available. But anyway, I'll let you talk about it. But yeah, you're in a much better. Do you want to? Well, I mean, that's it. And then we've got something I've got but then I can go into learnings after you've spoken about it, maybe. Do you want to go, Coffee, please? Yeah, keep going. Maybe we can go back to that.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mamfari or Kauto Ulasan, that's an indigenous language. I am an indigenous person, which means a wonderful afternoon to all of you. And thank you so much for inviting me. Storytelling is always fun. Anyway, I was invited to share about the story of Coffee for Peace. And to talk about Coffee for Peace is to talk about peace. And so for the first part, let me share to you our history, the peace building aspect, because it is the soul of what we do. And I think having this clear vision is also what helps us truly grounded, and to what pushed us to be intentional in financial sustainability, because we know that we are not just funding a program, we are living out a vision. And so Peace Builders community and Farzana, before that, may I say that I almost cried when you said about silent partner. That's just a very touchy issue for me. And I was trying, okay, now don't be sidetracked. Don't tell stories. So thank you for that. So anyway, and there are also two MCCs supporting us. The Mennonite Central Committee is support us for short term, if we do need relief aid during typhoon or during war. And our long-term partner is the Mennonite Church Canada. So they're both MCC. So, but they're also both Mennonites. And so Peace Builders Community is a Mennonite organization founded in 2006, right in the heart of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And that is an armed group that was fighting for autonomy from the Philippine government. And last year they had a peace agreement, and just something to share for, something to be happy about. And so Peace Builders Community is very firmly rooted in the history and context of the Philippines. That's why it started right in the heart of an armed conflict, because we have to go back to our history. And Philippines is a country that was deeply colonized for 400 years. And even though we are independent, like we have a flag, we have a government, we are still deeply colonized politically, economically, and socially. And that's what makes me really sad, especially the social aspect. The way we see beauty, the way our education works, the way we approach international NGOs. It still comes from a colonized mindset. And I think that's important to understand as a local entity. What is our worldview? What are the stories that are deep within our DNA? We have to be aware of that. And that's where we are starting. What is our story as a country? And so, well, this is our stories are manifested in our current realities locally, which some of the this is not the full realities of the Philippines. I'm just picking some things. So it's a violence of injustice, which can be seen in dynasties, warlords, like modern day feudalism. In our national reality, we're a very conflicted land. And here's the thing. The very nations who successfully resisted colonization, in the south, the MILF, and in the north, where I came from, we are deemed as the enemy. We are deemed as headhunters and warriors, and savages. And it's like, oh, that shows how deep the conflict runs. That's so deep. And that's why we also have armed conflict groups. And then our global reality, which is manifested in unjust globalism. But that's not where we end. We have a vision. And I think that's what's good about life. We can always dream of something beautiful. And we dream of peace, even though it seems impossible. And this peace is harmony with the Creator, however that Creator is called. However, if the Creator is called Allah, in my tribe we call the Creator Afunyan. In other tribes we call it Panginoon or Diyos or Magbabaya. How do you call your Creator? Let's have a dialogue about that. We don't have to add another layer of conflict just because we have different names for the Creator. That's a spiritual transformation. Harmony with the being, psychosocial transformation. Who are we? We have lost that sometimes. Harmony with others, the socio-political transformation. How are the systems in our local and national and global realities? And harmony with the creation, the economic, ecological transformation. We do not have to kill the environment in order to live. And we also do not have to kill people to save environment. There can be both ways. And because we are a Christian organization, we have the cross in the center, Jesus Christ. And if you want, I can get sidetracked again of telling what that means. But yeah, we are, well, as Farzana said, transparent building relationship. Wherever we go, we show this. We are very transparent on who we are. So not even if when we go to Muslim communities or to other faiths that do not that have different ways of expressing their spirituality, we still share this, not to proselytize, but so that they also know who's coming to them. And not most of the time, all of the time, the communities are more open, saying if more Christian churches or organizations have been as transparent as you, we won't have any problem. So peace building is shalom living. And so our strategy is to have, I'll just read it. Imagine, by December 31st, 2025, each of our provinces will have a circle of leaders called Peace and Reconciliation Communities. The PAR communities in all the provinces of the Philippines would advance as a peace and reconciliation movement, it is an organism, not an organization, with an integrated framework for peace building, who are organized in partnership with the various parts of the people of God, who are mobilized to do ministries of justice and peace in the name of Jesus, and who will lovingly serve all the peoples of our land unconditionally, regardless of religion, ethnicity, or political ideology, to the end that our land will experience holistic radical transformation. And so this is the consciousness, vision, and strategy that the Mennonite Church Canada funded. They did not just fund a program. They believed in our vision. And so that's why they say, okay, we will partner with you in this vision. And it is a 10-year program. It's a 10-year funding, not 1 year or 2 years. And because our partnership was based on mutual trust and collaboration, as a community organizer, that was very liberating for me. Like, I do not have to put so much work on reports, trying to please donors, or doing the right liquidation. It just gave me the freedom to focus on relationship building. Of course, we do monitoring of evaluation. I still do my report. Don't get me wrong. I still do my financial things, but it's not the bulk of what I do. The bulk of what I do is community organizing. It's peace building. And to do that is to build relationships. And so our systems follow that. Because most of the times maybe, the systems dictate what people do on the ground. And what we are saying is this: no, the system should support what people are doing on the ground. And so because our partnership with MC Canada is based on mutual trust and collaboration, that is also my partnership as a community organizer on the ground. The partnership is mirrored. So now I have the space, we have the space and the time to also ask the people we work with, what is your vision? How do you define peace? What do you dream for your community? How do you want to go there? What is around here? And so there's time, and as Farzana said, we were given the time to build relationships. And so I would go to communities, and just for 6 months, I would be there probably serving coffee. Like literally serving coffee, or washing dishes, or helping do the laundry, or going with the rounds of the people. And you cannot put that in a, what do you call that? The log frame? You cannot put that. How can you measure the impact of that? What did you do? Oh, I poured coffee today. But how deep is the relationships built? When I go to, right now, I know that everywhere I go in the Philippines, someone will always host me, bring me to their house, and talk, like, not having that power dynamics that I am the funder, I have the knowledge, but a partner to talk with. And I think that happened because I poured coffee. And so, with that in mind, with that framework in mind, PBCI was really thinking of financial sustainability. And because before going to that, actually in the 10 years of funding, the funding is reduced in a certain percentage for every certain years. I can't remember how much and how often, but it is with the understanding that Coffee for Peace will handle what is being reduced. So there's really an intentional. My English. Yeah, it's really very intentional plan to to reduce the funding. And I think it's also one way of decolonizing peace building and development sector, recognizing that there is capacity already available in the ground. And so in the first years of Peace Builders, the founder, the now CEO of Coffee for Peace, her name is Joji. She noticed that when they go to Christian communities, they offer them coffee. They go to Muslim communities, they offer them coffee. They go to indigenous communities, guess what is being offered? Of course, coffee. And she said, and so she said, oh, I think this is something in common with the three of them. And then there was this conflict between neighbors, between a Muslim and a Christian because of land ownership. And then please tell me how much time do I have?
You're good.
Okay. And then they were about to, as the conflict was about to escalate, and the founders of the peace builder missionaries invited these two people to have dialogue over coffee. And the conflict, and they were able to resolve their conflict without having to take arms. And so peace houses were built, and those peace houses were really places where people can safely go and talk about their conflicts, their neighborhood conflicts, without using guns and over cups of coffee. And a community member said, hey, this is kapi sa kalilintad. And that is a Maguindanaoan language for coffee for peace. And that's how Coffee for Peace came to be. So that's our values. It's the same as peace builders, actually. If you can see, it's still harmony. And this is the Coffee for Peace community model. And so Coffee for Peace and peace builders are like a coin. They're just one coin, but two different sides. You cannot separate any of them. But there are also activities of peace builders that Coffee for Peace is not doing. So peace builders community directly engage with farmers in the coffee trade. The International Peace Network, some of them donate or give grants, and some of them are also impact investors. And the peace builders community, or the PBCI, we do the training. It's a 3-year training for the farmers for social preparation. And so we are really focused on relational harmony. And then the Coffee for Peace, on the other hand, so that's why there's an arrow. So when the Coffee for Peace engages directly with the consumers, and its focus is on coffee quality. So Coffee for Peace buys from the farmers that peace builders trains. Coffee for Peace does not buy if PBCI did not train them. So, and also the International Peace Network is also the solidarity market. So that's really because fair trade coffee is quite high. It's quite expensive. And also the local peace network like churches, NGOs, as local solidarity market. So yeah, so this is just the coffee trading system. It was the same as the other notes. But then that one is 25% of our gross sales goes to create new communities of farmers. It is these gross sales that are now sustaining Peace Builders community, because right now CFP is supporting 75 to 80% of PBCI's expenses. It's what's paying me. And this is our revenue streams. So we have merchandise. So the red ones are the direct revenue streams. We have merchandise. We have green beans sold to local roasters and international roasters and traders. And then we also have roasted beans sold to local coffee shops and souvenir centers. And then the green one are the indirect revenue that we get from engaging with the farmers. And that is, we also do peace learning tour. We do training and consultancy on social entrepreneurship. And then we also collect a toll fee for our roasting service, because some of the farmers do not have a roasting machine yet. It's very expensive. So what they do is that they come to us to roast their coffee. And so we collect a certain amount for that. And so before CFP, farmers usually sell their coffee from 30 to 50 pesos per kilo, and $1 is equals to 50 pesos per kilo. And 1 kilo is 2.2 pounds. But right now, on average, after training, because we follow the Specialty Coffee Association of America standard, and the farmers will only finish the training when their coffee reaches that. If their coffee does not reach that, then they have to go through the same trainings again in order to reach that quality. And they're on average, they are selling their coffee at $5 per kilo, from 50 cents to $1 to $5. But that is just on average. Right now, we have farmers who won the coffee quality competition, and they actually came to Boston to have their coffee. What do you call that one? The one that like bidding, like because so many different coffee in the world come.
Oh.
Yeah.
Like cutting.
No, it's like bidding because their coffee is really good. It's like a market something. Yeah. And so they won, and so now their coffee is being sold at 800 divided by 15. Why? $14 per kilo. So that's the increase. And I wish they can be here with me and tell their stories too, because it is not just economic. Like, yeah, they were able to build. They're even richer than me now. It's like, ooh, that's really good. They were able to build their houses. They were able to send their children to school. But more than that, the pride. Like before, they would just, no, we're just farmers. But now it's like the pride of knowing that they're creating something beautiful. And so I think that's such an intangible thing. And so, yeah, and so this is our coffee shop. It is a showroom of the farmer's coffee. But yeah, so visit us there. That's it. So if you have any more questions, you can.
Pause at this point.
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll pause at this point, open up the floor, anyone here, but also online, for questions or comments about anything presented around like the themes that they've discovered in their case studies, Grace or David or Fasana, or if you have questions for Tala specifically about the work that she's been doing in the Philippines, please ask away.
I'd be happy to quickly just add some of the key lessons as well that we've found from the case study, if that would be helpful. So one of the so you've mentioned most of them, but one of the things that really strikes me about this is that you have an investor model.
Yeah.
So that was really that was a key success for us. Do you want to explain a little bit about that? Because then it goes beyond the traditional donor recipient relationship.
So instead of just donating, they give money as investment to Coffee for Peace. So which means they will have a return of investment. However, we only accept investment because we're also quite choosy with investors, because it's a vision. So investors who can invest are the people who share the same vision, which means we have a vetting process to ensure that the investors are not just about money, but do you really believe in who we are or in what we are doing? And so because of that, they would also be more lenient. It's not like the traditional investment scheme wherein your focus is just on the stockholders. But this one, the focus of the enterprise is for all stakeholders. So which means we are not just making profit for our investors, and the investors know that. But they do get return of investment.
Which is, I think, is really important, because it's not like the traditional setup of aid programs where it's just grants being given. It's really different. And then the other thing, I remember when I spoke to you in Mindanao, you were telling me about like how the Mennonite church has a very different style of doing things in the region, whereas other INGOs sometimes like live in gated communities and things like that, and the Mennonites have. I don't know if you want to go. You've already sort of mentioned it, but if you want to go into.
I think probably the Mennonite Church Canada in itself. And that's what also we are practicing. We do not put our brand out there. We do not put our anything. So, and also the way we live, for example, usually, I'm just trying to be so, but for example, we choose the simplest way of transportation. Like we ride the habal-habal, if that's a motorcycle, it's public transportation. And so, and usually when, I think it would be unfair to say probably some would invest on on a very expensive cars for transportation. Mennonite Church Canada does. Mennonites actually, not just Mennonite Church Canada, but Mennonites frown on that, and so we always look for how the people live as closely to the people, and so we do our trainings in porches or in someone's kitchen or under the trees, and then when it rains, we run inside the living room, and so those simple things that even though it sounds simple, but the effect actually is very great, because number one, it removes the power dynamics of especially the economic power dynamics. Number two, it creates the deep connection that these people are hosting us. We are not hosting them in a hotel. They are hosting us in their places. And third, they really own it, because it is like even the food, even in the trainings, because of this simple lifestyle, we actually do not fund food. They bring whatever food they have. So someone would bring sweet potatoes, someone would bring bananas, someone would bring chicken, someone would bring rice, and so we would share in that, and maybe we would bring bread. So yeah. So that lifestyle, it's good economically. It really saves us money, but at the same time, it really builds that deep relationship with the communities.
Great. I have a question from someone online. This is for the Stopping at Success team. The question is, can you please give us a sense of what percentage of the local entities in your review were NGOs and what percentage were for-profit businesses? Did you see any differences between success implications based on the type of local entity? So I guess the more traditional NGO model, for example, that you mentioned, in maybe like a blended sort of finance type model?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say the great majority of the organizations we looked at were local NGOs with sort of a fairly standard grants-based NGO model. We had about 4 cases where the transition was to government actors, so generally local municipal governments. And then I think, is it 2 social enterprise or for-profit cases? Partner and then Coffee for Peace. Yeah, so then I think that's a rough breakdown.
So two out of 20, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. 10%.
Oh, thank you. But it does underscore, we saw a really broad and interesting variety of cases, 20 case studies across 13 countries. And I think we are able to pull out lessons learned for a variety of cases there.
Any questions for people in the room or online?
Well, you said this is the final year of the consortium. How will these findings be shared as like best practices to USAID partners?
Yeah, so that is actually, we have like the last, we have some time at the end to speak about like how we will be developing tools and resources to make the findings useful to people in the sector. So we're working on that, but we do have some ideas around like the types of resources that we could develop. One of the things that we're thinking about is having a sort of like a transition tool. So INGOs that are looking to transition or to embark on a sort of exit, like if there is a way we can make, like, you know, develop a more tailored, like a tool for them, or transition workshop, learning exchange for them, that's one thing. And there are a variety of other things actually. I don't know if there's any that highlight. We have like kind of guidelines that we're developing to.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about those in a couple minutes, but our theory of change suggests that we can achieve change through targeting both local organizations and CSOs, INGOs, and then large donors, primarily USAID. We're joined today by Elliot from the USAID Local Works Office. So we're trying to develop tools to target each of those audiences. Along the lines of what Farzan said.
Right. And to add, we do have a website and it's on the back of this little like one pager. But that will compile all of our case studies will be published there, all of our cross-case analysis papers will be published there. All of these guidance tours and things like that will be hosted on our website. Yeah, so stay tuned with us as we get those up and running.
Yeah, sorry, one request. If you would just announce your name and organization. Sorry, I forgot to say that earlier, just so we know who you are and where you're coming from.
Hi, I'm Elliot Signorelli. I'm a monitoring and evaluation specialist, and I'm the activity manager for this award. I work in USAID's Office of wow, sustainability. I didn't lead with the E3 because I'm going through it in my head. I'm like, wait, what's the order of you have to do the acronyms, but yeah, E3 is let's see, economic growth, education, and environment. So E3 LS, Office of Local Sustainability. So thank you so much for sharing, Tala. It's a great story. And it's amazing to meet you after reading the case study. It's fantastic. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you wished that you knew going into the transition that you know now, that you want to share? Like, what were the biggest challenges that came up that were very unexpected?
For the transition, because here is the thing. Before when Peace Builders is started, it was already built in. Like, it was not something that, oh, let's do a transition.
Right.
It's just right from the start, it knows it is already locally led. And so I think that shifted the, I don't like the term, but the term that it shifted the gameplay. Like, we don't have to have that, we don't have to think of, we have to do this transition, but it's more of like, we know we are going to be self-sustainable. And so I think what the biggest challenge would be, it's both a challenge and a joy, actually, because of the values that the peace building values that Coffee for Peace is practicing, we are actually creating our own competition in the community. So, for example, I have different examples, but one specific example is that before, Coffee for Peace is supplying all the local coffee shops in the Davao City in the region, but we have trained our community partners. So now they are now supplying all the local coffee shops, and we are no longer supplying it. So that's a huge market removed from us, but that is a joy, because that means we did our training well. And so, but also, of course, it's always a tension of your values and your economy. And again, that's why I started with the vision, because that always helps us make decisions, even though it's tough economically. Especially, for example, an investor came in and said, oh, we're going to put up 10 coffee shops in different cities in the Philippines. Imagine supplying 10 Coffee for Peace coffee shops all over the Philippines. That's a huge amount of money. But then, the investor is just there for the money. And so we have to choose again based on the values that, no, we're not going to receive that investment. And I think that's a lesson, or probably that's the biggest challenge. And so always go back to who we are, I think. Especially in times when we are really scrambling to, probably, we are really praying hard to pay ourselves or to pay for electricity, or, it's real.
For the Stopping the Success team, I am Amy Ostrander from Project Concern International. Are all of the case studies focused on handing over from an INGO to a local organization, or is there also are there also stories looking into either an INGO or a local organization kind of handing over to a community and leaving? Is it focused on that one type of transition, or is it broader kind of exit strategies?
Yeah, so I think all of our cases are looking at an INGO dissolving into something. That something changes, but the INGO is always the exeter, as it were. What is interesting, though, in some of our cases, we see that the exit being planned from the beginning has really created a culture within the local entity to then want to dissolve itself. So, for example, in the Nuru Kenya case, we've had 2 cases out of the 20 where an exit was planned from the beginning. And that's really interesting because you see like it's entirely different, because capacity development is at the heart of everything because the goal is like for it to end, right? So everything is working to like the end goal of leaving and letting go. And so for in the Kenya example, it's really interesting that was like exit from the beginning was intentional. A local leader was intentional. All of these steps are really intentionally taken. The adaptive management example, anyway, all of that is happening. And they, the local staff, like changed the way the organization looked and went into cooperative farmer models. And then from there, they're now working to exit out of the cooperative farmers model. So we're seeing this in a couple of cases, which is really interesting, but it's always INGO to something.
And I think that's kind of goes to another question around how we define local, and the fact that we're not just thinking of like mini-me versions of INGOs, because we realize that in some cases, that's like, so for example, with the case of devolutions, when country offices devolve completely, that doesn't necessarily mean they're local. In some cases, they take resources away from CSOs within those countries. But then I think what's really interesting is that, and your case study kind of shows it, is that the kind of transitions continue, like it happens at different levels.
Yes.
And that it's not just like clear dichotomies, international, local. There's so many layers to this. Yeah.
May I also
Question here?
Do you want to add something?
Yeah, I think it's also like
Sorry.
I think it's also like between the local organization, like Peacebuilders Community and Coffee for Peace, with the communities. So it's that's why, because, and I think I'll go back to the mirroring of our relationship with MC Canada, because that is our relationship. And so Peacebuilders Community and Coffee for Peace, when we go, there's really this very intentional strategy or very intentional dream to not to be in the forefront. It's always locally led, even in the first day, especially in the first day, like in the first few weeks. The programs, we do not go with any programs. It's always locally led because they will be there. So they will be the ones who will be there. And so it's just like injecting a virus, but not putting a whole body, and which is the peace virus, and then letting the existing structure, letting the existing body there to do whatever it wants to do with the virus, which means the body can dance, or the body can fly, or the body can work. So it means the body, the community decides on what to do. And I think that's also crucial I think it's really a framework shift of like not going there and then training a group of people and then trying to step back. But I think this, we are really pushing for is that no, from the very start, you let them be the body, and whatever capacity development they need should start from them. Whatever resources they need, whatever questions asked should start from them. And that is easier to get out. But actually, we're not really getting out. Why? Because we've built long-term relationships. So getting out is not really getting out. But yeah.
Yeah, I think we've seen that across our case studies. And
Yeah.
that's what I think as INGOs, how do we conceptualize our role within the system? And I think it's important that we recognize that we're not even supposed to be here, right? But we're not supposed to be the leaders of development, certainly. And our role should be as facilitators and providing assistance to the people who actually are doing this on the ground, often through things like assisting with financial sustainability or capacity development in the ways that we've done.
Hi, yeah, my name is Ash and I will search for common ground. I was wondering if the SAS could provide a little more insight about what kind of metrics or maybe indicators they use to help define what was a successful transition.
Sure. I think we very deliberately took the approach of letting local organizations define success. So we didn't want to come in with sort of this imposed definition of organizational sustainability meaning success, or we left it to the local organizations to tell us what success meant.
Yeah, and one thing I think all of our case studies, they take place in such different contexts. So, we also did a world vision case study in the Philippines, but in Iloilo. And then the Mindanao case studies, they're also different. And I feel like given how different the contexts are, it's so difficult to have indicators, universal indicators. That is quite different. I mean, there are some like broad things I think that we can agree on, like around power dynamics, partnerships, building relationships, having collaborative decision making. But it needs to be applied specifically in different contexts.
The one indicator, I suppose you could call it, that all the 20 case studies share is that these organizations are still there. Which is an important thing, right? We're looking at positive deviance cases of transitions where local entities survive and thrive. But yeah, beyond that, we didn't want to impose.
And just as a brief follow-up, was there a kind of trend or a similar timeframes for between maybe initial involvement to when it did transition to more local ownership?
We saw a huge range, across the cases, going from, I'm thinking of CARE in Burundi, who actually planned this really intentional long-term transition to their local partner, really well thought out, and then had a funding shock and was forced to implement a transition in about 6 months. So that being on the really short end, to then the case of maybe Nuru in Kenya, which is still transitioning. It's been going for 8 or 9 years at this point. So a huge range.
Thank you.
I have a question for Tala. A few slides back, you had a graph. There's this outer bubble of green, and then these inner bubbles of red, direct and indirect sources of revenue. I was curious about one of those indirect sources. You called it a peace learning tour. I'm curious, what did that look like, and what does that entail? And did you think about this from the beginning, or did that just sort of come up and you say, hey, we could actually make this a source of revenue? I'm curious to know how much of that red and green was intentional, and then what emerged as time went by.
I think all of it emerged. Because Coffee for Peace started as a very small coffee shop, really just selling coffee. And then by then, because of going into that selling coffee, where do we get our coffee? So we have to go to coffee farmers. But then the next question would be, what kind of coffee are we having? So then it started evolving into training. And then actually, when you look at the market, coffee shops, the closure of coffee shop is quite high, because the capital needed to have a coffee shop is very huge. And to be able to compete with the well-established coffee shops, you have to really have this niche, like for example, offering a fourth wave coffee, or offering these certain kinds of coffee that takes huge amounts of capital, and we do not have that. So we have to look for other revenue streams, which we do have, and that is the coffee bean tree. That's why that's green beans and roasted beans. It came from training communities in coffee production. And then people come and they say, hey, they saw our t-shirts, like it was supposed to be our uniform, but then they say, oh, it's beautiful, and so, we can sell it. So that's t-shirts, and then mugs. People like mugs, like it's easy for gifting. So yeah, let's also have a mug. And then now there's bamboo mugs and bamboo straws. And yeah, and then someone would come in, like an artist, and say, hey, I have this necklace and earrings to sell. Can you put it in your coffee shop? And sure, put it in the coffee shop. And other social enterprises we have this chocolate cacao, another social enterprise. Can we put it in your coffee shop? Of course, put it there. And then we just get a little of the profit. And then the peace learning tour, because we are training farmers, it sort of became it just emerged because now government agencies are inviting us to show what we do with the communities, and people and organizations are saying, can we visit your communities? And it just sort of grew from there. And oh yeah, this can also be another revenue. So yeah.
Any other question? I do have a follow-up question. So I think, Farzana, you mentioned this during your bit. You said for the Coffee for Peace study that no money was exchanged for like the first 3 years. It was all about relationship building. Tala, you explained what that meant, but how did that actually work? Like, without any money, how did this relationship building actually happen?
Okay, because peacebuilders, it started on 9/11. This is the story of our founder, and I'm confident to share it because he shared it publicly. so this so he was a youth activist during the dictatorship time in the Philippines. But then 1986 People Power Revolution came, and so there was this divide in the New People's Army. And so to keep his family safe, he went to Canada, thinking that they would just be there for 2 years, just to until the Philippines, until the safety in the Philippines become until the Philippines become safer. And he's saying that God put him in Canada so that he can be removed of his violent tendencies, so that he can be a peace builder. And so when 9/11 started, he had this passion because he is a pastor and Islamophobia was on the was at its peak, and he was saying that, is there a way for Christians and Muslims to have a dialogue at this time, like this particular time of the century? And he remembered, oh, there's actually Muslims in the Philippines. Why am I looking at all these countries? I want to go back to the Philippines. And so when he said this to his superiors, because he was the general director of this global missions director of a big denomination in Canada, and so when he said to his superiors, he was told, maybe you're just going through midlife crisis. When he told it to his wife said, go to a psychologist first. He did. And he came back with a clean bill of health. And his wife said, oh, this must be God. And so that's when they went to Mindanao. And when he went there, that was the peak of the fighting against the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the government of the Philippines. And the narrative, the dominant narrative in our country that time, I remember because I was working with the government at the time in the communications department. So I remember all that narrative coming out of the media. Muslims are our enemies. Muslims kill Christians. Muslims are not to be trusted. And so what the founder did, my mentor did, he went straight to the heart of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And when so even the Christian public transportation drivers are afraid to go there. But he always says, but the Bible says, be fools for Christ. This is like, and so he went to the leader of the movement, and he said, my name is Dan Pantoja. This is my family in Canada. This is my ID. I am a pastor. And then he just laid all his story, very transparent. And the leader said, are you applying here for a job? So he said, no, I want to learn your story. I want to know if what the narrative being told to us is true. I want to know if Muslims are really our enemies. And I wish I had the slide, but yeah, it can take time. But so he stayed in the heart of that MILF and just built relationships. Like they hosted him. Actually, he's joking that, are they hosting me or they hostaging me? Because everywhere he goes, there's always someone with him. But he was told, like he was really invited to all the places that no one would have been allowed to go to, especially at that time. And actually, our Peace and Reconciliation module was first taught or was first developed with the MILF soldiers. So that's how it started, just listening. And when Peacebuilder's office was finally opened after a few years, the one who cut the ribbon is he is in the like a datu. He's one of the three. He's the one of the three datus who are in direct line of the Sultanate of Maguindanao, and that was the first time that happened, that a Muslim datu cut the ribbon of a Christian peace building mission. And so that relationship also enabled the start of relationships between the Philippine Council of Evangelical Churches and the Muslim community now, which is like it's actually strengthening or getting stronger because of that relationship.
And of course, he's the first 3 years, the Mennonite funded him, right?
Yes,
So
yes, the Mennonites.
they took a leap of faith in him.
Yes,
to,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
which is quite.
And also, it's really quite hard to put that in a proposal. Really, really. Try to imagine putting that in a proposal. What are you going to do there? Nothing. I'm going to build relationships.
So it sounds like charismatic leadership is fairly key then.
Yes. And being fools.
I want to be cognizant of time. Are there any final questions for anyone in here? Because if not, I'd like to quickly transition to a question about what tools are going to be made available and what might those look like. And I know the Stopping at Success team actually wanted to talk with you about that. What would be helpful? In what sort of mediums can they develop tools that are going to be of use to the broader NGO community?
Yeah, over to you. Thanks, Ben. So just really broadly, in year 3, we're looking to take the sorts of learnings and lessons and stories that we've gathered over the first 2 years and turn them into tools for use by local organizations, by NGOs, by donors to further this idea of locally led development through better transitions. And I think we would love to use this opportunity to have an informal conversation with you about really what do you need as employees in INGOs and foundations and whatever to influence systemic change to further the cause that we're talking about today within your organization. Presumably we're all here because we do share an interest in local development. So what would be helpful to you? Really broad. And we can provide a couple examples of tools that we're thinking about if that's helpful. Maybe we can start there. So one tool that we think would be really useful that we've seen a clear demand for is some practical guidelines on supporting financial sustainability in local entities targeted towards INGO staff. Just steps that INGOs can take to ensure that when they do go through a transition, they're setting that local entity up for success meaning to be financially sustainable in this case. So within that really broad framework and taking into account some of the things we've been talking about, within your organizations, maybe who do you think would find that useful? What's the right audience for that tool, and what format even do you think would be helpful?
Or if there are things that you've come across that you think are good and that we could, that we might be able to model.
Absolutely.
So I love that. That sounds really helpful. I'm also just thinking, I can't wait to read this case study. This was such an effective approach to making it known what's going to be included in the results of this research. So as you were talking, I was thinking for us, a quiz or something along those lines would be really helpful to actually plug in our plans as we think about transition for ourselves. I think it's easy to go through a checklist and think, yeah, I'm doing all that. But I think to ask some provocative and challenging questions that have emerged from your research, I think could be a really effective conversation starter within my organization. I'm from Root Change. I'm Alexis. So yeah, I think a quiz, I imagine that's probably a little more difficult to produce, but even if it was as simple as like rate yourself against, to what extent do you think you are doing X, to kind of even create a way for multiple team members to answer the survey and compare their results, or just start a conversation about how are we performing against these different kind of benchmarks or recommendations from this research.
That's really helpful.
That's a great idea. Yeah. I mean, we're looking to create something that's a little different from like a big report on financial sustainability. It's exactly the kind of idea that yeah, we think might be helpful.
I'll just add that I wish I could say that I came up with that idea on my own, but we're currently talking a lot about gender and how to incorporate gender into our work. And there are some great resources out there that are quiz style or like continuum style. I think actually USAID has like a gender continuum, but there are some resources that are interactive, which I think makes the conversation more interesting for the team.
Absolutely.
That's really good.
And can I ask actually, sort of on that point, who do you think in the organization would be a target for that sort of quiz? Like what kinds of people? Programs.
So I definitely think everyone should feel free to answer, but
Yeah.
for Root Change, I would say it would most likely be I could see it ranging from the people working on the proposal, because I think a theme that I really loved hearing is that it needs to be designed from the start. And I don't think that is always the case. And so I could see the proposal like targeting business development staff, as well as the program implementation staff. And I think it would be great to have not just the primary implementing organization, but also local partners completing a survey to hear, are we all on the same page about to what extent we are handing over ownership, to what extent this transition is going well? I think that would be a really cool conversation starter.
That's great, thank you.
You know, I would just add, like, as you are preparing resources, to keep in mind, that the best case scenario and planning for this from the beginning of the project life cycle might not happen, and then maybe having a few resources, like this is the best case scenario, but like say you're halfway through, or in the case of CARE, I was in a similar situation last year where our project was threatened with a very sudden stop of funding. Like what are some quick and dirty, if you will, type of tools, or one year out versus we didn't do our due diligence 5 years ago, and now we don't know what to do.
That's a great point. I think, yeah, sometimes we forget that it's not always the ideal case that we need to plan for. Yeah.
But it sounds like you have a number of case studies that are differing lengths, and the one you mentioned, I think from CARE, that they suddenly need to do it in 6 months. I think that would be like a good addition, if you could tie in specific case studies with specific toolkits of varying lengths.
That's great, thank you.
We have a comment online building on Alexis's, and that is in relation to the quiz, the more you can help the quiz get at what power imbalance looks like. Be important.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. So I think that, what I noticed from these examples is also to take into consideration that some of these projects take place in a lot of very kinetic environments. And the environment can change on the ground very, very quickly, which also I'm thinking of protracted conflicts, which significantly affects the project's sustainability and then an exit strategy. So I think that especially for our USAID rep, that keeping funding flexible for multiple years and understanding that as we start implementing these programs that we're going to have to start shifting what spending is where in order to get out in a way that makes sense while still protecting people's health, lives, and livelihoods.
I think that's a really important point, and kind of bring it to the exit strategies. I remember when we did quite a big literature review at the beginning, and in there, some of the key informants that we spoke to then, they were saying how actually exit strategies that are planned A to Z right from the beginning. That doesn't mean it's locally led because the local context change. So yeah, it's not like this technical thing where you have to have room for flexibility.
I think I've been thinking about this as we were sitting here from the aspect of some of the large-scale USAID grants that we work on, and I think something that would be useful from this is I think there's been a lot of progress towards sustainability and handoff to communities. Say we exit this community, our project is over, and building that in from the beginning. But it's more of a challenge to build in transitioning over to a local organization or building the capacity of a subawardee or a partner to be able to do these. I know that's something that USAID has tried to work on with USAID Forward and aspects of the journey to self-reliance. But so if it's not an express goal of that project, organizations are going to have a hard time getting that into their budget, as your budget is barely stretched to accomplish what you're asked to accomplish, which may be health or food security, whatever it is. And so I think having tools that help both the implementers think about what does it take in terms of timing or staff time or funding in order to do something like this, so that they can advocate to a donor and say, we think we could hand this off to and build the capacity of a local organization, but it would take XYZ. And then on the flip side, advocacy with USAID to think more often, should an express goal of this be to build up a partner who can take it over? Because I think if you have a health project and that is the goal, all of the budget is going to go to that. I mean, I haven't read them, but I assume, and it sounds like the lessons from these case studies are, you have to be intentional, and there's a process, and there are resources, and there's time behind building up these local organizations. And so how do we have that discussion about when and where and how we make it more explicit?
Such a good point.
So I don't know if that's a specific tool, but maybe
it is important to think about. I think it underlines that we are looking at a system here, and influencing only INGOs isn't the answer, and that USA, well, being in this room, we can pick on you a little bit, does need to change in order to further some of these goals. But I mean, so we do have cases where we saw really interesting examples where USA in particular has worked with INGOs to create sort of flexible procurement mechanisms that can create sustainable partners. One case that I researched in Timor-Leste, where it was a NGO capacity support project run by Columbia University, and they in their proposal they had two objectives. The first was to build local civil society capacity, and the second was to create a local organization to do the first objective. Those are the two things in the 5-year grant. That organization, which was created in 2004, is now the biggest peace building organization in Timor-Leste, Felon. And largely to do with the efforts funded by USAID through that grant. So we're definitely going to look to take some lessons out of that.
Yeah.
And some similar cases.
An idea from someone online. This comes from Caitlin, Solar Cookers International. She said, what about a webinar for local organizations suggesting non-traditional ways to partner? As an international organization, it would help if local orgs are already thinking of other ways to partner and then perhaps suggesting those themselves.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Because we've talked about, we do think about what resources would be helpful for CSOs as well. And we've talked about like how-tos to access like funding, like or unrestricted funding, but it is interesting to flip it on its head in terms of how to, like, what do partnerships look like? Yeah, that's interesting.
So I want to respect everyone's time. We're pretty much at time. But before we wrap up, just please join me in thanking our presenters for coming. The room is still ours for a little while, so if you want to stay after and mingle or chat with them or amongst one another, please feel free to do so. We have like coffee and tea and refreshments and all that, so please feel free to help yourselves. Thank you for coming, and those online, thank you also for coming. This will be shared afterwards. I can share presentation materials as well, so keep an eye out for an email from me on that. Thanks again, everybody.
Yeah, and if you didn't get a one-pager and want one, or if you want to even take some, we have extra if you want to do what you want to do with them. And then also our email addresses of us in the room are here, and then our website, which will be, again, evolving as the year goes on. But we'd love to hear from you if you have any thoughts or feedback, or if, ideas for tools come in the future, send them our way.
Thanks, everybody.
Do you have any tools now?